My name is Rick Goossen. Thanks for coming to this session on how to be an entrepreneurial leader. There'll be three parts of the presentation. One will be the actual material I'll go over in around 20 to 30 minutes, and then we'll do this action plan, then we'll have a group session together. Now, in terms of the outline, in a nutshell, what I'll cover in 20 to 30 minutes is how to be an entrepreneur, what entrepreneurial principles are. Secondly, is there a biblical perspective on entrepreneurship? So first, entrepreneurship, biblical perspective on entrepreneurship. Next, perspective on leadership, and then a biblical perspective on leadership. You put those two together, entrepreneurship and leadership, you've got this synergy of being an entrepreneurial leader. And then I'll talk about how you can have an exponential impact in business, in nonprofits, and in churches as an entrepreneurial leader. And then we'll conclude with an entrepreneurial leader action plan. So that's basically what we'll cover off in 60 minutes. Now, I mentioned in the remarks to the whole group that I cover a little bit of church history. I joke going back 300 years. You know, it's quite fascinating when you read church history that there's been a lot of what I call entrepreneurial leaders going back 300 years and much further besides that. I don't know how many of you know much about John Wesley. John Wesley, of course, is the founder of what became Methodism. There's 30 million people throughout the world who would be adherents to the roots of Methodism. John Wesley actually grew up in the bosom of the Church of England and very much did not want to leave the Church of England. But what he did is his teaching wasn't accepted in the established church. Guess what? They weren't innovative, creative enough. So then he actually took his preaching to the masses. So he was one of the people who was out there in the parks, on the streets, preaching to the masses when the established church didn't always want him there. And then when he preached, so he was one of the original Pentecostal style preachers. So there were so many people speaking in tongues and being filled with the Spirit, and that a lot of other people got really, really uncomfortable with what John Wesley was doing. But you know what? He focused on his purpose, on his vision mission, which was bring the gospel to as many people as possible. So he didn't care about doing it through the established channels if they didn't accept his methodology. Now, it's really interesting. There's a guy, and he came to the U.S. too. It's quite fascinating, even in the 1700s. You know, missionaries going back and forth between the new country and old country, that type of concept. So it's quite interesting with John Wesley. Now, one little side note. Does anybody know who George Whitefield is? Another evangelist. So George Whitefield was this phenomenal evangelist. Had huge crowds coming out to hear him. In fact, if you read some of Benjamin Franklin's writings, he talks about going to hear George Whitefield and how this fellow was the most phenomenal preacher. But what's really interesting, not many people know about George Whitefield today, other than if you study a little bit of church history, because he didn't build an organization. So the difference between Wesley and Whitefield was massive. To this day, Wesley has 30 million plus adherents, people who came out of Methodism. George Whitefield has 0. John Wesley knew how to build an organization. He actually formed what in effect were cell groups, because he wanted to teach people properly, so he organized all these cell groups. The cell groups eventually evolved into a church. Now the next person, William Booth. William Booth actually came along 1800s. Of course, he's the founder of what is the Salvation Army. Salvation Army has got this massive footprint all over the world. One of the most respected, organizations there can be, despite its completely politically incorrect name, Salvation Army. I mean, is that not about as politically incorrect as can be? But they've got such a great brand name in terms of the way they serve people. William Booth actually grew up in the Methodist movement. But what happened is, with entrepreneurial organizations, classic life cycle is startup, high growth, plateau, decline. So Methodism started as an innovative initiative, and of course then it ossifies, because once Methodism got so big, it got respectable. And then they thought, this is, we get a little bit uncomfortable when people start to, speak in tongues and act too holy, like, it's freaking us out here. So what happens is William Booth took his gospel to the least desirable people in East London and started to build this massive following. And then again, there was a conflict with the Methodists. Now, William Booth, again, was focused completely on bringing the message to the people, coming up with new, innovative, unique ways to get the gospel out. What William Booth did as an entrepreneurial leader actually led to what became the Salvation Army. And he, too, originally didn't want to start his own movement. Now, does this sound similar to a lot of entrepreneurial patterns? You know, people come up with new ideas, and often the new ideas are not accepted within the existing structures. And so then people have to go outside the existing organization to build their particular entity and to drive their initiative forward. Why do you think churches keep self-propagating? Why do parachurch organizations keep self-propagating? Because often the existing infrastructure has ossified and it's no longer open to new ideas. So unfortunately, existing organizations often aren't prepared to change, so that people take what they're doing, go elsewhere. D.L. Moody. If you read some of the bios on D.L. Moody, I mean, it is mind-boggling how innovative and entrepreneurial D.L. Moody was. You know, again, in terms of bringing the gospel out to the people. Now, there's a number of institutions that still are connected to him. Of course, Moody Bible Institute being one of the best known. There's also a school for high school in Boston, or in Massachusetts. So there's lots of things that still bear his imprint, but it's quite fascinating the way D.L. Moody got involved in big-scale evangelism, organizing many groups, mobilizing people, getting together the resources, you know, whether it was for the YMCA or whether it was for the Moody Bible Institute or launch an evangelistic campaign. D.L. Moody was always focused on how to make the impact, regardless of whether we had the resources to do it or not. I'll figure out how to get the resources. Now, to our modern day, there's many examples of entrepreneurial leaders, and I'll talk about two. One is Bobby Grunewald, and one is Mark Burnett. I'll start off by talking about Bobby Grunewald. One thing that I do, I work with a company that focuses on high net worth individuals, family business owners, and entrepreneurs. I also run this organization called Entrepreneurial Leaders Organization, where we organize conferences for Christian entrepreneurial leaders. We've done 25 of them over the last 11 years. We did one in Toronto last year. Our keynote speaker and the person who got our Entrepreneurial Leaders Award is this fellow, Bobby Grunewald. Has anybody heard of Bobby Grunewald? A few. Has anybody heard of the YouVersion Bible app? Of course, most of you. I've got it on my phone. Probably most of you do. It's been downloaded 200 million times. It is the most unlikely entrepreneurial story you can possibly imagine. So Bobby Grunewald is from Oklahoma City. He's based there. He had two high-tech startups. Started both, did well, sold them, so-called successful person. This is the way he tells the story. So I met with him and spent some time with him when he was out for the conference. So, you know, relatively successful guy. His picture is in the paper in Oklahoma. Anyways, him and his wife are in Oklahoma thinking, we got to go to a new church. So they hear about this thing called Life Church. Okay, well, we'll show up there. And he thinks, you know what? I like music. In fact, he says, and then this is, again, this is the way he tells him. He says, I fancied myself a Christian rapper. I was a really bad rapper, but I thought I was a Christian rapper. So I really love music. So I went to the church, and despite his high-tech success, he thinks, I'll get involved in music. So he joins the band. So he's up on the stage, on the platform at the front of the church, playing in the band, doing his thing. Well, this church had just started, and there was a really great preaching pastor who's still there. And then there's this guy who is an executive pastor. The executive pastor is a former HR guy from Target. So high-level business guy. So he's sitting in the congregation, and he looks at, you know what? He spots this guy at the front, and he thinks, that guy looks familiar. Isn't that the guy whose picture was in the paper? Well, what's he doing up there playing music? Anyways, he meets him afterwards, says, let's go for lunch. So he says to Bobby Grunewald, are you the guy who I saw in the paper who had all this high-tech success? Yeah, that's me. So in terms of your gifts for ministry, how do you think you can use your gifts? Well, I love music, hence I'm playing in the band. Have you ever thought, now for all of you in business, you're going to think, like, duh, this is so obvious, and you probably know where this is going. It's like, well, did you ever think of using your hard-tested market skills for the benefit of the marketplace? Not really. Well, no, I'm in work Monday to Friday. I'm in church. I'm doing the holy stuff. and I'm an amateur musician, and I like music, so that's what I like to do. No, no, no. Basically, the pastor who has a business background was wise enough to say, appreciate your music ministry, but you know what? I think we could use your talent in the high-tech sector to get the gospel out to more people. Why don't we try that? Okay, great. So let's do that. Let's see how we can use your high-tech skills in order to get the word out to more people. So 2006, now I'm really truncating this. There's a lot of information, so I'll just scoot over a lot of it. The book that I wrote that deals with all this, Entrepreneurial Leadership, is right here. Find it on Amazon. Idea, 2006. Now, again, if you understand entrepreneurship, haven't been involved in entrepreneurial things, you'll recognize all these things, and I'll tie it together as I go along. 2006, they have the idea. 2007, they launch a website. So they think, okay, technology, Bible, let's do a website. We'll put all this Bible stuff on the website. And the way he tells it is, I would tell you what the name of the website is, except that none of you would have ever heard of it, because none of you ever went to it. The website was an absolute flop. He says, I didn't even like going to my own website. Now, when we think of history, you go, 2006, you know what, with the rapid rate of technological change, that's like us talking about the Middle Ages right now, right? 2006, well, they launched a website. Well, people were starting to use their personal devices, so to speak. So everybody's walking around with their smartphone. They're not going, so he said, I didn't even like going to my own website. I got tired of that. So BlackBerry, was in its, starting its, arching and starting to go down at that time. So they did something on BlackBerry, a little bit of traction, but nothing to speak of. Then all of a sudden he finds out, you know what, we're shutting down the website. This is a complete waste of time, bad stewardship. But he starts to think about it, there's this thing called the iPhone. The iPhone is just starting really to get a little bit of traction, and they've come up with these things called apps. Now you think, this is so ridiculous. Come up with a thing called an app, like duh, like we don't know what apps are? Okay, this is all the way back in 2008. I mean, that's all of like 8 years ago. Can you imagine? 15 years ago, there was no such thing as an app? I mean, this is ridiculous. So 2008, moved to BlackBerry a bit, no traction. But then they figure out iPhone is coming out with the apps. First 200 apps. He says, hey, maybe we can get this Bible stuff as an app on the iPhone. First 3 days, downloaded 83,000 times. Okay, then they knew they had something. 2016, been downloaded 200 million times and counting. Now just think of that, and I'll talk about how he's an entrepreneurial leader. Just think about the innovation, the creativity, the desire to serve the market, to move forward. Think of the church as an organization that was open to somebody like him using his talents to get out the gospel. So that's an example of an entrepreneurial leader. Now here's a couple of really interesting quotes. We take a very entrepreneurial approach to how we reach people. Is that what most churches say? Is that like the slogan for churches? We take an entrepreneurial approach to getting the gospel out. Probably not. Almost all of our leaders are former business people in terms of our backgrounds. Not that that has to be the case, of course, but just saying that that's also what led to fertile ground for this particular approach. We have this explosion of tools and technology that has potential to knit people together like never before in history. So you need the horses to make that happen. One of those is Bobby Grunewald. So just think of the basic point of you can use your market-tested skills in a church context for spreading the gospel, right? Where we see that mesh, all those talents can be used not only in business, but also in church and in the area of nonprofits. So what I'll do now is I'll just scoot through this basic concept of, okay, what is entrepreneurship? Is there any biblical wisdom on entrepreneurship? What is leadership? Is there any biblical wisdom on leadership? What happens when you put the two together? You get this exponential impact and way more potential impact in your churches, in society, in your businesses. So what is entrepreneurship? One of the things I've done is I've taught entrepreneurship at Christian universities for around 15 years. And it's quite fascinating because whenever you teach entrepreneurship, every entrepreneurship book will have this chapter. The very first chapter in a book on entrepreneurship, do you know what it is? What is entrepreneurship? Now, I'm an attorney by background. I've been to 2 law schools, and nobody at law school starts off with, okay, great, you got into law school. Now we're going to talk about, is there law? What is it? well, that's why you have law schools. But when you teach entrepreneurship, the first thing you talk about is, well, what is it? And secondly, once you figured out what it is, you ask, well, can we actually teach it to anybody? Because you know you can't teach it, right? You just is one, or you isn't. Well, wrong. All right, so what is entrepreneurship? Well, let's look at some perspectives. So Howard Stevenson is a fellow at Harvard Business School. The so-called Harvard definition is the pursuit of opportunity without regard to the resources controlled. The pursuit of opportunity without regard to the resources controlled. So often entrepreneurs pursue something, not worried about, we don't have the money, we don't have the people. No, I've got the idea, I will make it happen. Larry Farrell. Now, Larry Farrell is a fellow who teaches entrepreneurship all over the world. He talks about customer product focus, high-speed innovation, focus on vision and mission. So, high-speed innovation, focus, customer product focus. You always get these great entrepreneurs, they love the product. They're the users of the product. You think Steve Jobs loved using the iPhone? You get the impression he built it for himself and was just glad that everybody else liked it too. Right? You read one of the best business biographies I've ever read is Walter Isaacson on Steve Jobs. I mean, it's imposing. It's, 800 pages long, but it's a phenomenal read. Then you read about this Steve Jobs was fanatical about the beauty of the product. So that's the classic entrepreneur, loves the product and is a user of the product. Jeffrey Timmons, he passed away a few years ago, but he was probably the leading entrepreneurship instructor in the US, was at Harvard, then went to Babson. One of the key points he makes is there are acquirable habits and there's non-acquirable things. So there's a core of attributes somebody might have, and it was mentioned earlier, these are things you can't change. Okay? You have a certain level of intelligence, like good or bad, whatever it is. Could we all be astrophysicists? Probably not. Could we all be an astronaut? Whenever, like, I'm from Canada, when they pick an astronaut, just like they do in the US, I mean, these are people who, they're like a medical doctor, they've invented 5 things, they're also an athlete. I mean, they're like these almost superhuman beings who seemingly can do everything so well. So you pick these people who are exceptionally bright. Well, all of us have a certain level of ability. You can't change that. But the good thing is, to be a successful entrepreneur, it depends primarily on the habits you can acquire. Because every entrepreneur knows that if you can't do something well, it doesn't matter, you hire the person who can. A lot of entrepreneurs have very poor educational backgrounds. These guys who end up being billionaires and all that. They don't have an MBA. They might not even have a high school education. Do they really think that's the recipe for building a great organization? No, what do? They go out and hire smart MBAs. So education, of course, has value. Those are things you can acquire. So you have to make this difference, have this clear difference between here's things I'm born with, can't change. Here's things I can change. That's what Jeffrey Timmons talks about. Last one, Peter Drucker. Of course, Joe, actually, he was speaking in the room before this. Now, Peter Drucker is interesting. He's written all these great books, Father of Modern Management, all that good stuff. I say one of the books he wrote on entrepreneurship, probably one of the best books on entrepreneurship ever written. 1985, Innovation and Entrepreneurship. Innovation is the sine qua non of entrepreneurship. That's the heart of entrepreneurship, innovation. All right, so let me summarize the essence of entrepreneurship. Number 1, innovation, doing something new, unique, different, and creative. Secondly, with a practical application. If there's no practical application, you're an inventor but not an entrepreneur. It's fine to be an inventor, doesn't mean you're an entrepreneur. Entrepreneurship, all about new, unique creation of something with commercial application. That's how entrepreneurs think. There's a problem, I have a solution. I'm addressing some need. Seizing opportunities. Entrepreneurs are known for being opportunity obsessed. You go on a holiday, you're sitting at the beach and you're coming up with ideas. It's almost like you're programmed to always think in terms of what's the opportunity? I could solve that problem. I could make money from that. I could serve people. So opportunity obsession. Self-inspired behavior. Nobody has to kick a true entrepreneur out of bed in the morning or kick you out the door and get you motivated. Ever notice most entrepreneurs are self-motivated? They've got this passion inside where they want to pursue something, do something, serve a need. Doing risk analysis. Entrepreneurs, it's a myth that they take risks. They assess risks. They're very careful risk assessors. But risk is an important dynamic of the entrepreneurial equation. There's always people sitting on the sidelines who don't want to take the risks, never get the gains. It's never the most intelligent people who get the rewards. You know, I'm from Vancouver. The property market has been going like this for 5, 10, 15 years. It's absolutely crazy. The smart people are on the sidelines going, oh, the market's overheated. The market's going to collapse. It's overheated. Because I had this discussion with my kids. Those same people have been saying that for 15 years ago, 10 years ago, 5 years ago. So the smart people are on the sidelines losing out. The dumb people are making all the money. Now, of course, yes, markets crash at some point. Yes, of course, you know that. But, you know, it's an interesting dynamic because a lot of people don't have the guts to take the risk, to go for it. Quite fascinating. Entrepreneurs, they go for it. They know no fear. I'm going for it. I'm starting that. Oh, I'm going to look stupid? What do I care? How many people really feel like that? Oh, I've got an image to protect. Like, I have to... Screw that. Forget about the image. Entrepreneurs, they couldn't care less. You know, most entrepreneurs fail before they succeed. I've interviewed over 300 entrepreneurs. No entrepreneur would say, you know what, it's phenomenal. Everything I've done has worked. It's unbelievable. You want to rub my big toe? Everything I've done has turned to gold. It's just amazing. Okay, that person is either the 1 in a billion or the biggest BSer in the world. It's just not true. It's just not true. Developing entrepreneurial habits. So the good thing is you can develop these entrepreneurial habits. The key thing is, I'd summarize it as, there's a fellow named Daniel Goleman, talks about emotional intelligence, social intelligence. Emotional intelligence are all those skills you need to succeed that are rarely taught at universities. You know, the ways you get along with people, the way you bring people together. That's why when we talk about entrepreneurship as a pursuit of opportunity without regard to the resources controlled, that's because, you know, most entrepreneurs, you got to be careful. You get to know a true entrepreneur. He or she will soon rope you into something. All of a sudden, you're helping that person, probably at no cost. Oh yes, you can, now the guy's using my garage, he's using my resources, he's coming in using this and that. Oh no, yeah, that's a classic entrepreneur. He or she is figuring out how to make things happen without having all the resources. Now, are there any biblical perspectives on entrepreneurship? Absolutely. So, here's one simple one, parable of the talents. It's quite a fascinating parable. You know, the master goes away, gives talents to the different servants, 5, 2, and 1. The servant who gets the 5 turns it into 5 more and is commended and given more to look after. The one who has 1 takes it, buries it in the ground, doesn't even get interest from the bank. He's condemned as the wicked and slothful servant, cast out into outer darkness. You ever think of that parable from a risk standpoint? Did you ever think what that means in terms of how we steward our own resources? And doesn't it seem harsh the way the servant who had 1 talent is condemned? The person who had 1 didn't lose it, just buried it in the ground, took it out, and here it is. So just think of that from the standpoint of how to manage resources and the value of taking risk when using your resources. Second point, what about creativity? Innovation, as I mentioned, at the core of entrepreneurship, innovation ties to creativity. God is a creator, we're designed in God's image, we're creative beings. Do you ever think that when you're involved in the creative process, you're actually doing something that is a God-ordained activity? Do you ever think of that? Do you ever ask yourself, if you're a creative person, where does creativity come from? It's something that's non-quantifiable. It's almost unexplainable. We all have different forms of creativity, but it's interesting because when I've come up with creative ideas, or one thing I really love to do is to write. So I've written a number of books, and I'll say to my kids that I can imagine the book in my mind, and I just have to, I can almost close my eyes and just write it for days on end, because I've got the whole thing imagined in my mind. And I feel like I'm stealing from everything I've ever read, every person I've ever talked to, and it's just somehow synthesized, and it just, like literally, I can type fairly well, it just comes out as fast as I can type it down. I don't know where that comes from. All of you have some form of creativity. Like, how do you come up with ideas? Now, people who are musical, people have different talents. So creativity, is that a rational process? You can't explain creativity a lot of times. So we would believe we're designed in God's image. We're creative beings. We can be engaged in creative activities. So entrepreneurship has that really exciting element. So that's entrepreneurship, biblical perspective on entrepreneurship. Now I'm doing this really, really quickly. And like I say, there's 200 pages of explanation here. So next, let's look at leadership. So what do leaders do? Now the whole conference has talked a lot about leadership, so I'll just throw out a few points. John Maxwell, I'm sure most of you have heard of him. He's our speaker in Toronto next year, sold 26 million books, been ranked the #1 leadership guru in the world. He talks about leadership as influence. Leadership is influencing others. He's got this really, really great book, The 5 Levels of Leadership. If you haven't read that, it's an excellent book. He talks about the pinnacle of leadership as actually turning followers into leaders. That's a key aspect of leadership. So leadership is influence, casting vision. Most great leaders have a clear vision. Not everybody wants to follow the vision. Fine, move on. But most great leaders have a clear vision. Right? You look at a lot of political leaders. I mean, go back to Churchill. You look at Margaret Thatcher. Margaret Thatcher, if all of you remember Margaret Thatcher, I mean, there was this great line about her, "This lady's not for turning." I always thought that was the greatest line of all time. You ever know what that means? This lady's not for turning. Like, if she says we're going, they call her the Iron Lady. This is where we're going. And there's jokes about all the whippish men in her cabinet, right? But like okay, this is what we're doing. You don't like it, beat it. This is where we're going. Cast vision, create organizational culture. That's why I gave the example of John Wesley. Can you imagine John Wesley from the 1700s, and he still is so off-quoted, as was quoted earlier today in these great sermons about give all you can. It was like make all you can, save all you can, give all you can. Well, he had a great organizational structure he put together. The evidence is still with us today. And then serving their followers. That's been talked about here too. One of the great myths is like I lead and I tell everybody what to do. Well, we all know it doesn't work too well. When you look at John Maxwell's book, 5 Levels of Leadership, the lowest level of leadership is based on title. Mike, well, I'm the leader because I have my title. You're doing this. That usually doesn't work too well. Right? You start going one level up, it's based on respect. Mike, okay, we're working together. I want to help you, you want to help me. Go, hey, yeah, we're working together. Well, people have a much different attitude. I don't know a lot of people who say, yeah, please boss me around and I can do things at my expense for your benefit. But rather the better forms of leadership are where, I can reach my true fulfillment and use all my gifts and have true meaning and purpose by working together with you. So you as my so-called leader are the person who's actually giving me the greatest opportunity for fulfillment. Man, I'll follow you to the ends of the earth. That's leadership. So those are some basic principles on leadership. Now in the Bible, of course, there's lots of great examples about leadership. I'll just refer to a few. Now, spirit gifting. It's quite interesting because there's various spiritual gifts in the Bible. And there can also be elements of leadership that are spirit gifted. I think we've all come across people in our church communities where you go, this person, like if I tried to convert somebody, it's not going anywhere. This person, I don't know what it is, but they can say the same thing I would have said and they have a completely different impact. Like, like that's just the way it is. So there are people who have like literally spiritual gifts and have this massive impact, whereas others won't in that area, but we're gifted elsewhere. Circumstances. There's many circumstances in the Bible where the leader arose because of the circumstances, whether Moses or many other examples. And it's just like in life. There's lots of people with maybe great leadership potential and abilities, but they need the circumstances and the opportunity to exercise those abilities. And not all of us will get that opportunity. And that's fine. We're all called to different things. But from a biblical standpoint, the opportunity has to be there for the person to develop that potential. The community. Now, this is a really interesting thing. On the one hand, we have to have the confidence of our own abilities. At the same time, we've heard discussions about getting input from others. So, there's, plans fail for lack of advisors, but with many, they succeed. So many times, you need lots of good advisors. Now, what I found growing up is that the church community that I was in, there's a couple of people who wanted to be pastors. And the church actually didn't support them. And you know what? We all thought the church was right. And decades later, the church was proved to be right. There's many other people the church supported, and those are good choices. But these couple of individuals that I know as, childhood friends, there was just something, it was like being a pastor would do a lot more for them, like the position would do a lot more for them than the other way around. So in other words, I can be sort of like now a leader when I'm not really a leader in my real life. So the idea of community helping select who the leaders might be, I think there's a lot of value to that when exercised carefully, right? So I think the community element's important. Then we talk about making followers into leaders as one of the key elements of leadership. All right, so putting these two together, entrepreneurial principles plus the leadership principles. So what I've found is that not all entrepreneurs are leaders, and not all leaders are entrepreneurs. Well, when you get the two together, they have an exponential impact, because these people with the innovative, creative spirit and understand the ability of their influence can move organizations, whether they're businesses, nonprofits, or churches. I'll give this example of Mark Burnett. So Mark Burnett, I got to know when he came up to Vancouver to accept our award and also do a keynote presentation. Does everybody know who, especially here, does everybody know who Mark Burnett is? Do you know his story, the crazy story? I'll give it to you just in a nutshell. Like, he told the story, but it's also in his book and probably in a lot of some of the stuff written about him. So he's from the UK, grew up in East London. His dad worked at the Ford Motor Company plant. He said, I was in the wrong part of town with the wrong accent, wrong background. I didn't really have a lot of potential to go anywhere. So what do? You join the army. So he was a British paratrooper. And he described how, I guess every time when you're a British paratrooper, when you go into dangerous territory, you have a tendency to die. So you have to write a letter that they keep on file that would go to your loved ones saying, you know, I love you, sorry, you know, obviously you're getting this because I passed away, blah, blah. He had to do that 21 times. He said it almost killed his mother. So he actually fought in the Falklands War. So he did that, and he thought, you know what, this is not for me anymore. I'm gonna go to the US. So he emigrated to the US, and he had one friend who had a limousine company. So he figured, okay, I'm gonna ride. He actually came to Los Angeles, arrived at LA airport, and his friend was supposed to get him a job as a limo driver. But apparently he wasn't that good a friend because the job actually fell through. So he couldn't get a job as a limo driver. So then apparently he finds out that, okay, what else can I do? Okay, so if you're really clean and, you know, you're clean, you're neat, you're tidy, you're good with weapons, what could you do? You'd be a nanny, right? Wouldn't you make a great nanny for some rich guy in Beverly Hills with two kids who are maybe going to inherit tens of millions of dollars? So you're a guy who is really clean, neat, tidy, good with weapons, perfect. So he becomes a nanny. It actually sounds like a reality TV show that he later developed, but anyway, and he actually tried to get that out. That's one of the few that didn't work. Because of course he has Shark Tank, Celebrity Apprentice, The Voice, and Survivor. Oh yes, almost forgot Survivor. So when he came up to Vancouver, it was phenomenal. Every night of the week, his show was #1 on network television. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. Isn't that phenomenal? The guy has no background in film production whatsoever. He really loves the outdoors, loves adventure. Anyways, so he starts off with this job as a nanny, and then he starts thinking, you know, I gotta make more money. So he saves up a bit of money, buys some space on Venice Beach, starts to sell t-shirts. Makes money selling t-shirts. So if anybody bought a t-shirt from some guy with a British accent like 25 years ago, that would have been billionaire Mark Burnett selling you that t-shirt. Anyway, so one thing leads to another. He has this great love of adventure, starts to get involved in this thing called Echo Adventure. One thing leads to another, gets Survivor. He didn't actually come up with the idea. He bought it from somebody else, developed Survivor. One thing led to another, develops this massive production facility and this expertise. But then what happens is, you know, it's interesting with his faith, because his faith was basically dormant, and then he met Roma Downey, touched by an angel, and then that reawakened his faith. One of the comments he made when we had him down in Vancouver was, I realized I wanted to do something significant with my life. Can you believe that? This guy's like the #1 guy in Hollywood for cranking out these shows. I want to do something significant with my life. So now who's the type of guy who, if you imagine what Hollywood is like, so he comes up with this idea, I'm going to launch the Bible miniseries. Oh, really good idea. That was, I think, a $30 million adventure. So he bankrolled that to get it rolling. Can you imagine, with Mark Burnett's background, nobody would take it on except the History Channel. So I remember in Canada, it came on right after the Vikings, and probably right after that was some cartoon series. So no major network would take that on, even with his track record. Then the Son of God movie. So he was behind that. Now they're doing Ben-Hur. Now, who could, if you tried to organize that as a churchy thing, Who could take that on? Who would have the ability to make that happen? Well, I'd say a true entrepreneurial leader is the type of person who can make that happen. I don't know who else would have the expertise and the passion, the desire to make that happen. Now, he made this comment that's really fascinating. I don't know if you find this, but sometimes when you come from sort of an evangelical background, you have a sense as to what proper religious evangelical speak is, and you know what's not. But when you have somebody like Mark Burnett, he's got this English sort of borderline smart aleck, foul mouth, very accurate way of putting things. So he made some really funny comments, but he was quite strong on this one. Like, he basically said, you know, Christians, he said, I don't get it. There's apparently like 2 billion of us. We are the largest, most ineffective tribe in the entire world. We're useless. We don't get anything done. Nobody in Hollywood cares what Christians think because they're so useless and ineffective. They're completely disorganized. He says, the world will be one when we are one. And so he finds himself in this position where when he's trying to get these things rolling, he tries to get the support and input of the broader Christian community. So what we'll do now is around 5 after 3, for let's say just 10 minutes or so, which I think will be enough time. Now, does everybody have this sheet right here? If you don't, you can just put up your hand. There's my assistant over here. My unnamed assistant in the orange, I can't read her name tag, will give you one of these. So what I'd like to do now, as a continuation of the presentation is, so let's look at your role as an entrepreneurial leader. This is a very, very simple thing to fill out. I thought it would be worth doing it in 10 minutes. I'll give you some brief instructions as to what the purpose of it is. So I've done this presentation on entrepreneurial leadership, entrepreneurial skills, biblical perspective, leadership skills, biblical perspective. Two together, entrepreneurial leadership, exponential impact. So you have to think like an entrepreneurial leader. How can you actually take this and apply it where you are? So think of it either from your business standpoint, like in your business, or maybe you're involved in a parachurch organization, or maybe at your church. So number one, my organization. What does it do? Who does it serve? Now, when I've done this, I've trained denominational leaders. Often the joke is, I have no clue. I don't even know who I am hardly. I don't know what we do. Anyways, so what does it do? Secondly, my role. How do I contribute to what it does and who it serves? That sounds pretty basic, right? But it's like, so what do we do and what's my role in it? Now, think of, as an entrepreneurial leader, now again, think of, is this most appropriate to your church or your business or a nonprofit you're involved with? Ideas. What do I see that can be done differently in order for my organization to be more effective? So just think, okay, what's the number one thing I can think of that we could do differently and our organization would be more effective? Secondly, resources. What are the resources necessary to make the change? Well, what you might find out is, you know what often the biggest resource is? The desire to do it and the creativity. Now, a simple example. Okay, let's say with churches. Could we offer ESL classes? We have a bunch of people of a different ethnicity moving into our neighborhood. They don't speak English well. They're immigrants, whatever. Want to start an ESL class? Well, we have a bunch of rooms that are Sunday school rooms, so we have a facility. We have a bunch of members who have English as their first language. Why don't we try that? What do we need? Maybe we need like a government license or something? Like it's not that complicated. Or what about we have a gym? Well, why not maybe get connected to, let's say, a local high school? Or at our church, we have the local Boy Scouts chapter meets at our church. Like these are simple ideas people can come up with. So third, risks. What are the risks in terms of initiating change? I don't know. What is the risk? We'll look stupid. We'll be embarrassed. What, we tried something and it didn't work? Big deal. What's the risk? And you know what? It's not like, hey, Gary, let's get together $1 million, and once we have the $1 million, we'll start it. That's a bunch of nonsense. You know, most great companies start with very few resources. Now, some businesses are capital intensive, but many of the great ones start with virtually no money. It's not the money, typically, that's the problem. It's the idea. The rewards. So now think of the risk, but what would the rewards be? You start the ESL program. Well, that could be 100 unchurched people going through your church every week. And who's teaching the classes? Oh, people from our church. Oh, and we're meeting in our church. Well, that might not be a bad idea. That might be more people, unchurched people coming through your church than any other means. Culture. What culture needs to exist in order to support and sustain change? So what would we have to change to drive this forward? Then goals. What are 3 goals I need to reach in the next 90 days to measure progress? So just think, if I want to move forward with this, well, what are some practical things? Not, you know, like, let's think of, okay, if it's the ESL program, okay, I can go and talk to somebody at our church. Who is the person at the church who might be motivated? Secondly, I can find out, do we need a license? Thirdly, are there people who would be interested to teach? Very practical things you can do. All right, so it's 11 minutes after 3. I'll give you, let's say, 10 minutes just to fill this out, and then we'll just have a group discussion. I think it'll be quite interesting. Okay, why don't we get started, and then for those of you who are still working on it, just continue to do so, and then maybe we'll just start off with someone who has some idea that they came up with. So if somebody can give us just a short profile of, you know, what they filled out. Great.
I'm a urologist.
You're a
urologist.
Urologist, okay.
You're the stream king. Anyway, using a new laser.
That's a really interesting example because, of course, it has all the hallmarks of an entrepreneurial process, right? So the things you don't have, you can figure out, okay, where do you get those from? There's always certain obstacles you got to overcome. Obviously, when you push things through, there's always that importance of focus, getting the team together, you know, but at the end of the day, you can have a great impact, right? Change the way things are done.
It's a win-win-win.
Yeah, and it's never easy, obviously. It always seems easy in retrospect. It's never easy when you're doing it. Another example? Anybody? Yeah, because Lori Beth Jones is one of the speakers. Is she speaking tonight or tomorrow? Tonight, yeah. You know, it's interesting too, sometimes when you look at entrepreneurial ventures, and this came up in the earlier presentations too, this idea of, you know, realistic feedback. So whenever you have an opportunity or an idea, you always have to look quite almost harshly at, well, who else is doing it? Who else could do it? Can they do it better? Can they do it cheaper? Can they do it faster? And really take a hard look at that, because it's interesting with almost any business opportunity I've been involved with and companies that we work with, you know, it's a jungle out there, right? I mean, when you think of the competitiveness of the marketplace, so I think obviously none of us can ever underestimate how many people are trying things, doing things, and have got maybe more resources. But at the same time, I always think of the high-tech space. No matter how big some of these companies are, like for example, Microsoft. I heard Steve Ballmer speak a number of years ago at a conference, a high-tech conference in Silicon Valley. And at that time, they were still committed to buying 20 to 25 companies per year, anywhere from 50 to 250 million. So you think, here's, you know, Bill Gates, you know, smartest man in the world, hiring all the smart people. But this is basically acknowledgement. We may think we're the smartest, but you know what? There can still be, you know, there's companies in little hamlets in Canada that get bought up for 50 to 100 million because the guy just came up with some brilliant idea. It's literally started in his garage. And places all over the US, all over the world, right? And these big companies realize, okay, we may be smart, but there's lots of good stuff happening. So that's almost the inspiration for entrepreneurs, right? If you've got some great idea, I mean, you can compete. I mean, it's not easy, but you can compete in this big jungle, right? You know, it can be lots of big players out there, but if you've got something good and know how to focus, yeah, you can still make it happen. Anybody else? Anybody else have something they want to share? You got time for one more? Okay, how about a really bad, instead of a really good idea, how about a really bad idea? So who's got a really bad idea that wants to, you know, share it? Anybody? Not that we won't push it too. Last, Maria? No? Maria? Mike? My friend Mike here? No? Dan? No? Jonathan boards recently. And it's quite interesting that it's hard for one group of people to come up with all the good ideas. And David Benthal referred to this too. You know, we focus on not so much a board of directors, but a board of advisors that comes in for specific reasons and deals directly with the entrepreneur or ownership family. And they work really well because it's like fresh blood, new perspective coming in. I just want to make a few comments by way of conclusion. So when I talk about entrepreneurial leadership, what I find exciting about it is, if you look at church history, virtually all the great movements in church history have come from people who were effectively entrepreneurial leaders.
I mentioned some up there, and in our present day, whether it's the Bill Bright, even Robert Schuller. It's quite interesting. Robert Schuller is almost the quintessential example of an entrepreneurial leader, the way he flamed out, because they're usually not very good at succession. But he actually started off. You know what? How the Crystal Cathedral happened? He's actually from the Midwest, came out,